Manny. We got everybody on mute. Okay. All right, so good evening. My name is Harold Popko, and on behalf of the North York Branson Medical Society, of which I am the president, I would like to welcome all members and guests to the scientific session of our annual general meeting. The membership of the North York Branson Medical Society consists of over 500 Toronto physicians from all specialties registered with the OMA, south of Steeles, west of Bayview, east of Keele, and north of the 401. One of my mandates as president has been to promote the exploration of medically innovative ideas and to try to break down the barriers that stand in the way of delivering those innovations to our patients. Tonight is an example of putting those principles into action. On March 23rd, 2020, here in the city of Toronto, the mayor declared a state of emergency due to COVID-19. On that very same day, our first speaker, Dr. Russell Reiter, along with 7 of his colleagues, had an article published in the journal Life Sciences explaining how melatonin may have a role to play in the treatment of COVID. That article, and others like it since, have been largely ignored by the medical community. Tonight is an opportunity for course correction. Tonight, we will have the privilege of hearing from 4 outstanding speakers, followed by a panel discussion where we will be joined by distinguished experts from the Cleveland Clinic and the University of Buffalo who are undertaking research on the topic under consideration. Due to time constraints, I will not be doing any of our speakers justice with the short introductions I will be providing. For that, I apologize to them in advance. Dr. Russell Reiter is professor of cell biology at the University of Texas Health, San Antonio Long School of Medicine. In addition to his PhD degree, he has been awarded 4 honorary Doctor of Medicine degrees and 1 honorary Doctor of Science degree by international universities. He has had a long-term interest in the biological and medical actions of melatonin. The Web of Science has listed Dr. Reiter in the top 1% of world scientists in terms of frequency of citations of his published works. It is our privilege to have Dr. Reiter start us off this evening. Dr. Reiter.
Thank you very much, Harold. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to melatonin as it relates to COVID. And of course, the important thing is that SARS is an unwelcome death, while melatonin is an endogenously produced substance in the body that changes in terms of amount during the course of your life. In the elderly individuals, it's very much suppressed. This is an illustration of some of the things that go on during a COVID infection. It's a very complicated situation. And primarily, what is known is that angiotensin 2 is converted to angiotensin 1 through 7. And this allows for the entrance of the SARS virus via the ACE2 receptor into the cell. This activates a number of things that culminate in the production of reactive oxygen species, that is, free radicals, derivative of oxygen that are highly active. Additionally, angiotensin 2 acts on its receptor to stimulate NADPH oxidases, which also generate free radicals. Free radicals are, of course, not necessarily bad, but in excess, they, of course, induce inflammation. And additionally, they activate NF-kappa B, which translocates to the nucleus, and of course, generates a number of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which influence the inflammasome. And this inflammation generates the cytokine storm, which produces more free radicals. So this becomes a vicious cycle of free radical production, and of course, the associated injury. The recognition is done initially by the alveolar epithelial cells, particularly type 2 pneumocytes. There are 2 types of pneumocytes lining the alveolar sacs. The type 2 has the largest number of ACE2 receptors, so they are most commonly affected or most easily affected by the entrance of the SARS. These cells, along with some others, then release attractants that recruit, in fact, monocytes to the inflammatory site, and they are converted to type 1 macrophages. Type 1 macrophages are extremely pro-inflammatory. And of course, under usual conditions, an inflammatory condition will resolve itself. But in terms of infected cells with COVID, the inflammation gets out of hand. A lot of different things happen. For example, immediately when there's some oxidative stress, there's oxidized plasma lipids, and this activates the trail receptor, which also stimulates NF-kappa B and, of course, the associated cytokines. Additionally, cells and natural killer cells and activated T cells get involved by releasing granulocyte macrophage colony stimulating factors, which activate the Janus kinase STAT pathway, which also causes production of inflammatory cytokines. Collectively, of course, a large group of cytokines are produced, as illustrated here, and they collectively promote oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is actually what causes the damage. Now, these are the type 1 macrophages. As you will see, there's another type 2 macrophage that is certainly much less harmful. This is a summary of what happens. Here, the lungs, the coronavirus is inhaled, isolates itself in the alveolar sacs. In the alveolar sacs, I told you the type 2 pneumocytes primarily, of course, take in the virus. They cause cytokines to be released, and these cytokines release or cause the production of free radicals, which damage the endothelial lining. That cellular debris, along with edema, accumulates in the alveolar sacs, and edema being from the nearby capillaries, and this contributes to the difficulty with breathing. Additionally, however, these cells notify distant macrophages to arrive at the inflammatory site, and they are activated by something called the macrophage activation syndrome, again, which produces cytokines and chemokines and the associated free radicals, which then do further damage. So it becomes kind of a vicious cycle where these cells, because of their repeated production of cytokines, generally cause massive damage. Inflammation becomes, of course, out of control, and respiratory damage culminates in what are referred to as acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. And if it's prolonged, of course, hyalinosis also appears. And of course, as a consequence, there's fibrotic tissue. So there are pathological consequences after the fact, even though there may, in fact, be the situation may be resolved. There are roughly, I think now, more than 31 publications that have suggested the use of melatonin as a treatment. And of course, the clinical studies in that regard will be discussed by other individuals. The damage is really done by free radicals. Free radicals are reactive oxygen species derivatives of oxygen. Their reduction generates a superoxide anion radical. It is dismutated or removed by an enzyme to hydrogen peroxide, and it is converted to the hydroxyl radical. Additionally, the superoxide combines with the gas nitric oxide to generate the peroxynitride anion, not per se a free radical, but a strong oxidizing agent. And these asterisks indicate those substances that are in fact directly scavenged by melatonin based on the publishable data. How important that is, however, in vivo is unknown. Certainly the enzyme superoxide dismutase and glutathione peroxidase are also activated by melatonin, likely by a receptor mechanisms, and they remove these molecules such that they cannot be converted to the very highly toxic hydroxyl radical and peroxynitride. These are the two that you want to avoid at all costs. The rationale for the use of melatonin to treat virus and disease actually has a very long history. This work is 30 years old, where encephalomyocarditis virus, this was primarily the work by Ario Conte, George Maestroni, David Ben Nathan in Europe. They showed that each of these viruses, Semliki forest virus, these are all animal studies, of course, West Nile virus, are all reduced. The severity of these conditions is reduced by treating the animals with melatonin. Likewise, Venezuelan equine influenza myelitis by Castillo in Venezuela showed that this melatonin also reduces the viral load and prevents the death of mice. And Legrand Ellis showed that in Lucian mink disease virus, again, the death of the mink can be prevented. And even in plants, melatonin, of course, is found in plants as it is in all other species. And in these plants, it is also related to the severity of viral infection. Melatonin is very likely not a virucidal, but may be able to inhibit replication as suggested by several publications. One of the major things we think is happening is represented here, monocytes, which give rise to the M1, that very aggressive macrophage that is pro-inflammatory and produces a host of cytokines that initiate or cause the cytokine storm and the related free radical generation, can be converted back to an M2 macrophage by melatonin. These cells have a very unique metabolism, not unlike cancer cells, in that they use aerobic glycolysis in lieu of oxidative phosphorylation in their mitochondria. Melatonin converts them back to a normal type cell that is anti-inflammatory, and in this way, we think that's one of the mechanisms by which melatonin, of course, reduces the severity of these infections. Of course, they also can cause multiple organ failure when it gets into the bloodstream, and it causes sepsis and multiple organ failure. In other words, the disease is obviously not confined to the lung. This may be a little bit of heretic for some of you people, but I want to present it because melatonin should be used as a treatment for COVID in the context of this idea alone. Pasquale's wager was, Pasquale was a physician scientist in France, and he suggested if you have a molecule that works, and I substituted melatonin here, obviously he did not know about melatonin, but if you have a melatonin that works against COVID, you should take it, because if melatonin is effective, of course your health is improved. If you take melatonin and melatonin doesn't work, it's irrelevant, because melatonin, you will still have the COVID infection and the diseases associated with it. If you don't take melatonin and melatonin works, the likelihood of having some severe health problems is enhanced. But of course, if it don't take melatonin, it doesn't work, it's irrelevant. Of course, President Trump was given melatonin when he was diagnosed with COVID. Those physicians at the National Naval Medical Center obviously knew the literature and decided they would supplement it with melatonin, as well, of course, as a lot of other molecules. Now, this work is going to be discussed by another author from the Cleveland Clinic. There's another very important publication from Columbia Medical University, which shows that melatonin improves survival of intubated patients, whether they are given oxygen or not. In summary, I have no conflicts of interest. I want to make that perfectly clear. I do not have any patents, nor do I sell any melatonin products. Melatonin is inexpensive and does not require refrigeration. It can be self-administered, and no overdose has ever been reported to the extent where people have died, or even an animal has died from too much melatonin. And many studies have been done in an attempt to identify what is referred to as a lethal dose for 50% of the animals, and that lethal dose has never been established. Melatonin can be taken or administered by multiple routes, of course, orally, sublingually, intranasally, rectally, and other route you can think of. Maybe it's especially useful in remote areas for individuals who do not have access to regular health care. This is obviously a very brief introduction, but gives you an overview of what we are looking at from the molecular standpoint. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so tonight we have an opportunity to consider a paradigm shift. What if COVID could be treated in the community, completely avoiding the need for hospitalization, or as much as possible? Dr. Richard Neal has been living this paradigm since March, putting theory into practice, and has, to my knowledge, more experience doing that than anybody else in the world. Dr. Neal presently practices in primary care in Castroville, Texas. He has a master's degree in public health from Harvard University. He is board certified in aerospace medicine and served over 20 years in the US Air Force as chief flight surgeon before retiring as a colonel. His final job with the Air Force was as chief of medical force protection for Headquarters Air Force Security Forces. While researching countermeasures for chemical, biological, and radiological weapons, he discovered melatonin was useful for all three. Tonight, he will share with us his observations on how melatonin can be useful for treating COVID. Dr. Neal.
Thank you. Certainly an honor and a pleasure to be a member of this panel tonight there. And now that Dr. Ryder has shown us why melatonin works so well, I'd like to get right to the meat of the talk about how it's done clinically. So as point out, I've actually been treating patients with melatonin since March. I have long ago lost count of how many patients myself and my colleagues have treated. I've tried to get other doctors and different things to use melatonin with only limited success, but certainly the ones that have tried it have all also given me feedback that they've had as much success as I have. So one of the well, I lost my place here. Oh, so certainly we've treated, I'd say at this point, well over 1,000 patients, but also we've treated patients with all of the comorbidities, and they've all done well. We've treated patients with diabetes, hypertension, COPD, asthma, certainly even cancer and obesity and those at advanced age. I've actually treated patients from 11 months old all the way up into their late 90s. One of the great things about melatonin is actually its versatility in dosing. I generally dose at roughly 1 milligram per kilogram per day. For most patients, that works out to about 100 milligrams a day. And most patients I've found have preferred to take roughly 20 milligrams 3 times a day and then 40 milligrams at bedtime. The only side effects we've really encountered have been vivid dreams and drowsiness. And so I've always been worried, certainly anytime you're giving somebody super physiologic doses of something, you always have to worry that there's somebody out there who's going to react adversely. But early on, I had 2 patients that told me they had palpitations, but certainly we see that with the virus as well. I had 2 patients tell me that they got anxious when they took the large doses of the melatonin. Oddly, those were in the first couple of months with the first wave of the virus. I actually have not had anyone complain about anything but drowsiness and some vivid dreams ever since. Now, in addition to the resistance from, unfortunately, a lot of providers who don't want to give their patients supplements or something, feel that melatonin is only for sleep. The patients actually have some fears as well. And I've had patients who refuse to take the melatonin. Some patients are scared to take the melatonin because they've heard that patients with coronavirus die in their sleep, and they don't want anything that's going to put them to sleep. So, but most patients, the really great thing about the melatonin is most patients respond really rapidly. And usually sometimes within hours and certainly within the first 24 hours. I can give y'all some individual anecdotal stories. As the very first patients I treated, the first one was a gentleman in his 40s who'd been running with a fever of 103.5 for 3 or 4 days, as well as having body aches and the loss of sense of taste and smell and such. He was the first patient that I got to try the melatonin on, and he took 40 milligrams that night, never ran another fever, never, all his body aches and everything were gone. He was also actually so short of breath when I first talked to him that he couldn't complete a sentence without taking a couple of breaths. And I was really concerned that he was going to wind up in the hospital that night. But his cough was much better in the morning and resolved totally over about another 3 days. Now I had him follow that up. Initially, I was concerned about the half-life of melatonin, so I had him take 10 milligrams every 2 hours the following day. Other than making him drowsy, he did fine. Like I say, he never had any more fever, and all the symptoms resolved rapidly. About 3 days later, his wife actually came down with the fever and the body aches and the cough. I started her on melatonin that evening as well. And she was symptom-free the following morning and never had any more symptoms of the virus. I have had 2 patients that were hospitalized on high oxygen concentrations that have managed to get melatonin. One of them took 100, they both took 100 milligrams at night. One of them they both had normal oxygen saturations in the morning off of oxygen. One of them went home 2 days later. The other one was hospitalized for a little longer. But by far, out of the 1,000+ patients that we've treated, I'm unaware of any patient who's wound up on a ventilator. I'm unaware of any patient who's passed away. I've had less than a handful of patients who actually wound up in the hospital, and those patients were either with a secondary pneumonia or dehydration from having significant GI issues with that second wave of the virus. I actually treated one pregnant patient. She was about 35 weeks pregnant. About day 3 or 4, she started having contractions, and I stopped the melatonin. Found out later from Dr. Ryder that that melatonin actually enhances contractions. So there's no surprise there. Luckily, she was doing fine by that point and did fine from that point forward. So
great.
So the other thing, I had a group of migrant workers. There were 60 migrant workers that worked for one of our local ranchers. They lived in a bunkhouse, literally on top of each other. And about 8 of those gentlemen came down, all in ages about 20 to 40. 8 of them came down with symptoms of the virus at once. Of course, we started them on the standard 100 milligrams of the melatonin a day. The other 52 individuals, we gave them 40 milligrams a night just for prophylaxis. Not a single one of those individuals developed any symptoms of the virus. So I have since treated a lot of family members when there's one individual in the household who comes up positive for the virus, and they're either caring for elderly parents or caring, there are other individuals in the household. I've started many of those on 40 milligrams as a bedtime dose, and a very large majority of those have not developed any symptoms of the virus. So children, children for the most part, I don't treat at all. Most of them don't need any melatonin, but those that have started running fevers and coughs, for my dosing schedule, I'll give out for children from 0 to 2 years old. I've given them 1 to 2 milligrams of the melatonin 4 times a day. They've needed it. It's amazing. You give them the melatonin, their fever goes away in about 30 minutes, and most of them have only needed a few doses. For the 2 to 6 year olds, I dose up to 20 milligrams a day, but they can go from 2 to 5 milligrams. Usually I dose them 4 times a day, parents like that. 6 to 12 year olds, I'm doing roughly 40 milligrams a day at 5 to 10 milligrams QID. And then finally for children over 12, I pretty much dose them based on their weight, just like the adults. So I'm aware that some of the, at least one hospital that's been treating their inpatients with melatonin have been giving them 40 milligrams TID. And apparently have had some good success with that. I've had the most I've given a patient at a given time is 240 milligrams in a day. So that's, again, like I say, the nice thing about melatonin is you can keep giving it to them until it takes care of their symptoms, and they do well. So let's see. I do use other things in addition to the melatonin. I mean, melatonin really for most patients out there works really well as a monotherapy, actually. I tend to give other people the vitamin D, the vitamin C. Some people, especially the asthmatics and patients with pretty bad COPD, I pretty much automatically go ahead and start them on steroids and maybe give them a Z-Pack. I prefer to talk to patients pretty much individually and individualized doses on most things. I don't generally shotgun the approach. If I wait, a lot of the patients who've come to me when they've already had the virus for a week and they're doing pretty rough, I'll tend to go ahead and give them the antibiotics and the steroids. A lot of them are already getting the secondary pneumonias and such. Z-Packs tend to work pretty well. There's a lot of resistance to Zithromax in this part of the country, but doxycycline has worked well also. I've only had one patient who failed on the Zithromax and doxycycline who wound up in the hospital with IV Rocephin and Levaquin, and he did fine after a couple of days. Also, again, use albuterol in some of the patients that come to me that are short of breath. And that's pretty much it from the clinical standpoint, as I.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you. And we'll have a further discussion during the panel, and then when you open up to the
now my.
All right. So our next speaker is Dr. Rafael Castillo. Dr. Castillo has vast experience treating hospitalized COVID patients with melatonin. He is a professor in cardiovascular medicine at the College of Medicine, Adventist University of the Philippines. He's a senior consultant in adult cardiology at the Manila Doctors Hospital. He is a recipient of 45 awards in recognition of leadership, academic and professional excellence, research excellence, and community service, including the Lifetime Achievement in Cardiology Award given by the Philippine Heart Association and the Philippine College of Cardiology. For the past 20 years, he has been writing a weekly commentary on varied health topics for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the leading daily newspaper in the Philippines with a regular readership of 2 to 3 million. In one of those articles, he actually reached out to the public to advise them on how to use melatonin. So that I think we can discuss that a little later as well. So Dr. Castillo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Harold, for that generous introduction. And thank you also for this kind invitation to share with you our clinical experience on melatonin. I'd like to share some, okay, yeah. I I hope you can you see,
Yeah.
can you see the slide? Okay, thank you. So, well, firstly, from the 7,700 sunny islands in the Philippines, we'd like to greet you mabuhay. It's a generic greeting we give to our friends and loved ones. Literally, it means may you live well, so mabuhay. Okay, so well, we call our melatonin initiative MAC 19 Pro, which stands for Melatonin is Adjunctive Treatment in COVID-19 pneumonia patients requiring hospitalization. Well, in the first week of March, our Minister of Health, Secretary Duque, confirmed that we had a first few patients with confirmed COVID-2019. And in the first month, that was in March, several of our colleagues died from COVID. These are frontliners, and three of them are very good friends of mine, two in the same hospital where I work. And this was really very depressing to all of us. And at that time, you know, we didn't really know which worked for COVID. So we were figuratively clutching at straws. So we tried all sorts of medications, lopinavir, other antiviral medications. Where we tried hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin. We tried tocilizumab and other anti-inflammatory agents, but we were not really getting the results that we were not saving our patients. We had a high mortality, particularly on the first month. Well, although it was like trying to chase an enemy in the dark, at least we knew a few things. As elegantly explained to us by Professor Reiter, well, it was quite well known. It was established how the virus gets into the body via the ACE2 pathway. But one thing which really perplexed us is the rapidity of the course. You know, you admit the patient who's still okay, you know, with some pneumonia. You're talking to the patient when you make rounds. And then in the middle of the night, you're called because the patient suddenly goes into severe respiratory distress and the patient has to be intubated. So very rapid course. And it was quite obvious that it was no longer the virus, which was the main problem, not the viremia, but the resulting cytokine storm, which was caused by the initial viral infection. So then we realized that we were barking up the wrong tree. We were focusing on antiviral agents when it's no longer the main problem in hospitalized patients. So well, we were quite familiar with this slide. So in stage 2 and stage 3, it's more the inflammation which really gets a patient hospitalized and which for some of them would require intensive care and perhaps mechanical intubation and mechanical ventilation. But in these stages, the viremia is no longer that prominent. It's more the inflammatory and the hyperinflammatory response. Well, initially we thought that the early intubation and mechanical ventilation would be good for the patient, but again, the mortality was still high. More than 50% of our patients who were intubated and mechanically ventilated didn't make it. And so while we thought that it was likely not the right way to go. And right in the first month or first few weeks, in fact, in March, well, our healthcare workers, particularly our frontliners, were getting exhausted. And at that time, we only had close to 1,000 patients with confirmed COVID-19. So, well, but everyone with mild symptoms of upper respiratory tract infection, they immediately went to the hospital. It was like a bank run, and the hospitals were getting congested. And well, I wrote a series of commentaries on the problem, and while we said that well, we didn't really have much time, and we called for a whole of society approach, not only a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach. And well, it was quite clear that we were already in imminent healthcare collapse. Well, we still had enough beds, enough ventilators, but the trajectory was pointing to a very alarming trend where we'd go to healthcare collapse. And we proposed as early then that we had to shift the front lines, okay, from the hospitals, which were really getting congested, to the community level, just exactly what Dr. Neil was and is still doing in his area. So we needed to treat the cases at the community level and make sure they don't get worse. That would require hospitalization. And of course, at the same time, we wanted to cut the transmission. So we made a massive public health education on isolation, precautions, quarantine, and physical distancing. So I think this strategy was quite effective, shifting the front lines to the community level and empowering the primary care physicians. But many of them came back to us and said, well, we don't feel sort of confident of treating COVID patients, so what can we do for them? And so we had to equip them with some strategy. And essentially, we told them that the primordial strategy would be to boost the immune system. And we coined this armamentarium. We call it the MACE-CD. M is for melatonin, A, vitamin A, Z is for zinc, E, vitamin E, and vitamin C and D. And we hypothesized that if we can give this to our patients with who are at high risk of developing COVID, particularly those with exposure, and those with already mild symptoms, then there's a pretty good chance that we might prevent their worsening to more severe COVID that will require hospitalization. Well, initially it was quite a challenge trying to convince everyone about the melatonin, particularly at the dose that we recommended. Well, just to share with you, I've been taking melatonin personally for the last 26 years, and it had a life-changing effect on me. I used to have severe bothersome allergic rhinitis, and I would say it was melatonin that really helped relieve the condition, and I've been taking melatonin ever since. And I've also been prescribing it while in patients who had inflammation. So we've been giving it in patients with severe infection, particularly those who required mechanical ventilation. And in fact, we've been given, I understand that many of the members of the society are trauma specialists. We've been giving it in trauma patients, particularly in those with brain trauma. But we gave it at the dose which is much lower than what we give now. Well, the maximum dose that we gave before COVID was 20 milligrams, so we would give it at 10 to 20 milligrams per day. Okay, and but for COVID, we thought that intuitively we thought that we really need a much bigger dose, so 20 milligrams would not be adequate. So we started with 36 milligrams and gradually increased it to 72 milligrams per day. And well, our experience during the first month was quite good already. And at that time, I had a privilege of meeting Professor Ryder, Professor Don Shantan, Professor Greg Brown, and of course Dr. Harold Pupko and Dr. David Striner, and they were big. They rendered big moral support to our local initiative here. Professor Ryder and Dr. Danshin Tan encouraged us to report our initial experience on melatonin, and we did that. We published our first report in melatonin research. This was published in June of this year. Okay, so this was a case series of our hospitalized patients. So a report on the first 10 patients we admitted in our hospital between March 5 to April 4. That was the initial salvo of the pandemic. And these were patients with high risk features. Actually, 5 of them were physicians, senior physicians in the hospitals who were frontliners, who are frontliners. They went back to the front lines. And we gave it, as I mentioned, a dose of 36 to 72 milligrams per day in 4 divided doses. 3 of these 10 patients had moderately severe ARDS, 1 with mild ARDS. 7, they had classical symptoms and radiographic presentations of COVID pneumonia. 7 had positive RT-PCR, 3 had negative, but knowing that some of our COVID patients can have false negative and all other features strongly indicating that they have a COVID infection. So we continued treatment for COVID. And these were our observations in these 10 patients. All 10 patients given high dose melatonin, 36 to 72 milligrams per day, had a predictable clinical stabilization and improvement within 4 to 5 days after initiating melatonin. And all these patients, including the 4 who had ARDS, survived but none required mechanical ventilation. The 7 COVID positive patients were discharged at an average of 8.6 days. The 3 negative RT-PCR were discharged at 7.3 days average. Comparing that to COVID patients admitted during the same period who were not given melatonin, the average hospital stay was 13 days. Again, just for perspective, we know that the groups were not comparable, but this to offer us an inkling of how melatonin might be effective in COVID patients. So comparing the 10 patients given high dose melatonin to the other COVID patients admitted in the same period who were not given melatonin, but who were given practically all the other treatments that were given the patients on high dose melatonin. So 12 of 34, or more than a third of the patients who were not given melatonin died, compared to 0, no mortality in the high dose melatonin group. 1/5 or 20.6% of those not given high dose melatonin required mechanical ventilation. Of those who had classical COVID symptoms but turned out to be RT-PCR negative, 40% of them died, and more than a quarter of them required mechanical ventilation. And as far as side effects are concerned, none of the patients complained of bothersome side effects. The only reported side effect in this 10 patients were sleepiness, which was deemed to be a favorable side effect, as most of them usually had anxiety and symptom-related sleep problems. Well, that was the initial report, and we it was a purely observational report, and we thought that we needed to validate that with a really well-designed trial. So we immediately drafted a protocol, a randomized double blind controlled trial, and I must acknowledge the assistance of our foreign colleagues, again, Professor Ryder, Professor Danshin Tan, Professor Brown, Professor Schreiner, and Professor Popko. they really assisted us in the drafting of this protocol, and we were really passionate in immediately starting, but there were a lot of challenges and constraints, and one of them, of course, was funding. President Duterte, I'm sure you know our president. He's quite a strong-willed president. He got wind of our study, and he personally endorsed our study on nationwide television. And I must say, because of his endorsement, that we got an immediate funding from our Department of Science and Technology and research aid and main research agency. So the trial is currently ongoing, and hopefully by end of the first quarter next year, okay. So meanwhile, because it would take some time to come up with the results in our randomized double-blind controlled trial. Meanwhile, COVID patients were dying, and we thought we should come out with a statement. And meanwhile, we were also getting more adherence to high-dose melatonin. Four of our former ministers of health, secretaries of health, joined in this consensus statement drafting. This is one of the Mach 19 Pro initiatives. Again, we were joined here by our foreign colleagues, and we circularized this to practically all medical societies on the use of high-dose melatonin. And we were focusing more on hospitalized patients, patients who were symptomatic, and we recommended higher dose, those with hypoxemia but no ARDS. Well, we started with 4 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. Those with mild ARDS, we would start at 6 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. And those with moderate to severe ARDS, so we recommend 8 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. And we've used up to 600 milligrams per day in 3 to 4 divided doses in a good number of our patients. Read on the chat box, Dr. Layton, Dr. Edward Layton was asking if we have a high dose preparation or stacked dose for melatonin. Our stacked dose here is only 3 milligrams per capsule. So
Fortunately, Dr. Castillo is frozen, but we'll wait for him to come back on. In the meantime, just a minor correction. I'm not, everything he said is true other than the fact that I'm not a member of the Department of Psychiatry. So hopefully Dr. Castillo can reconnect. And I think what we'll do is proceed to our next speaker. And maybe we can get back to Dr. Castillo a little later. Hopefully we can get back to him because he's an important part of this panel as well. Now, the reason we're here tonight is thanks to Dr. Gregory Brown, who recruited me into action to spread the word on melatonin's potential use for treating COVID. Dr. Brown is a University of Toronto trained psychiatrist with a lifetime interest in biological psychiatry. After graduating, he worked with a pioneer in neuroendocrinology, Seymour Reichlin, at the University of Rochester, obtaining a PhD. Upon returning to Toronto, he began research on psychiatric patients, examining pituitary and pineal function. He is presently Professor Emeritus, Department of Psychiatry, University of Toronto, and collaborator scientist in molecular brain research at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Currently, he's part of a group examining genetic systems and mitochondria that are related to the pineal gland, body rhythms, and sleep-wake mechanisms. Dr. Brown.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harold. I hope everybody can hear me and that I'm unmuted. I'd also like to thank all the speakers and panelists. It's great to be able to interact with people. It's also great to have an opportunity to talk to Ontario physicians, people, many of whom are skeptical still. And this is a very exciting time for us because it seems that melatonin may be coming into its own finally after many, many years. And I'm glad to hear that this randomly controlled trial is underway. 2 weeks ago, I was online listening to a program originating in Spain, hosted by Dr. Dario Acuna Castroviejo, and an exciting event took place there. There is a randomly controlled trial underway that is rather unique. And it is a trial using intravenous melatonin. And it's on 18 patients. The patient phase of the trial is complete as of a few days ago, and the data analysis is now underway. So we'll be getting results from that very soon. Now, the reason for using intravenous melatonin is that the oral absorption of melatonin is variable person to person, and blood levels are very different, very low actually. You take a big dose, you get low levels in blood. And so intravenous gives you much better control of that. So it'll be exciting to see the results of that. Now, a keynote speaker at that conference, which was, as I say, hosted in Spain, was by a colleague of mine, Dr. Daniel Cardinelli. And as it happens, a paper on the same topic that he covered was published just a few days ago. And here's the title of that. And he's raising the issue of whether melatonin is potentially the silver bullet for treating COVID. Now, silver bullet refers to the treatment that used to be used in fables for killing werewolves. Of course, werewolves are supposedly people who could change into being wolves, and those wolves would be malicious and kill people. And the only thing that could kill that werewolf was a silver bullet. So the Daniel is making the comparison between melatonin and the treatment that could kill werewolf. And of course, COVID is the werewolf here. Now, on the next slide, you'll see the, if we could have that next slide. Yeah, you'll see a summary slide from that paper. And in the paper, he talks about the multiple ways in which melatonin influences the symptoms of COVID, and especially how it controls COVID, the cytokine storm that is really the thing that kills people. Now, I'm not going to get through that. Russ has done a fabulous job on covering that, but the paper does review this. And I'm going to go on now to a different topic, which is, if we can go on to the next slide. This is again based on something that was a publication by, let's go back from this, please. I want to go to the previous slide. The question is melatonin deficiency a unifying mechanism of high-risk patients with COVID? And this was raised by Dr. Simcoe with Russ, based on the fact that the elderly, patients with hypertension, diabetes, and various vascular pathologies have got low melatonin. So is that a risk factor, and does it lead to susceptibility? Well, that's a very good concept. So I would like to raise on the next slide a fact that many people do not know. and in fact, a lot of scientists don't realize, there is a simply huge individual variability in melatonin levels. And in fact, in some studies, the levels of melatonin are 20 times as high in one individual as in another individual of the same age. This seems to be a variation that is genetically determined. So some people, through their lives, have low levels. Other people have high levels of melatonin. Could this be a reason that some people are prone to develop diseases like COVID? And could the people who have high melatonin be protected? I think that is a major issue that should be considered. And so now there are other reasons. Next slide, please. There are other reasons why melatonin levels can be low. That first one is the genetic variation, but also treatment with beta blockers like propranolol or atenolol can lead to low levels of melatonin and could be something that makes people susceptible. Another issue to be considered, especially in these days of a 24-hour day with so much light around and people getting disrupted sleep, having inadequate darkness, using LED lights at night, this will all reduce their exposure to natural melatonin, and so the various factors can lead to low melatonin and may predispose to diseases like COVID. Now, so the issue of whether the low melatonin that is seen in the diseases as described by Simcoe and Reiter, I think it is highly likely that the low melatonin is the cause and not the effect. Now, if that's the case, what can be done? Of course, if you have inadequate exposure to darkness, sleep hygiene is a good treatment. The other treatment, of course, is treatment with melatonin. Now, we've heard of the use of melatonin as a treatment. Now, if we look at, however, the possibilities of that and what melatonin can be used, I'd like the next slide, please. The study done just a couple of years ago in Canada, which is applicable for products in the USA, shows that the melatonin available over the counter, both in Canada and the USA, has a very highly variable content. And in fact, within the same product, from time to time, it can vary, the content can vary by as much as almost 500%. So what can be done to make sure that if you're taking melatonin, that the product you're getting is authentically melatonin in the amount it's supposed to be? There is an answer to it. Next slide, please. There are 4 products on the market that have been certified by the USP, which is the US Pharmaceutical Association. That they are made by Nature Made and they're made by Natrol. And these are the only products that they have certified, and they certify products. They go to the manufacturers, they look at their labs, they look at their records, they take samples and they test the samples and compare them with authentic standards. So these are the only 4 products that you can say authentically have the right content. And so I would recommend in only using these products. So I would raise a question to the other panelists, the other speakers. Where do you get your products? How do you know you're getting the right amount? Do you have them made up for yourself, or what? What can you do? But what I can recommend to physicians who are watching is use these products. Now, my final slide is on a totally different issue, and that is that it's been a long time since we've known about melatonin. It was first identified by Aaron Lerner back in 1958, and then a Russian group in the early 70s found it located in the appendix using a bioassay. And following this, a Czechoslovakian gastroenterologist in Toronto did immunohistology using a specific antiserum, and he showed it was located all through the intestinal tract. And then he did a very key study. The key study showed that pinealectomy did not affect that gastrointestinal content. Furthermore, there is no variation in the content with light or dark. This is the first proof, and a substantial proof, that this did not originate in the pineal. It was separate, it was tissue related. Moreover, later, it was shown that the total content of the GI tract was somewhere about 400 times more than the content in the pineal. Now, it has taken, since that time, which is 1980, up until today, researchers, scientists, clinicians don't seem to realize that there is all this melatonin in the tissues, and that has a role, and that role is a protective one. And it's so exciting that today we're finally beginning to come to the grips with this. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss this and evaluate this. Thank you, Harold.
Thank you.
Now let's go on to the panel discussion.
Okay.
I am
Let me
official moderator, and then Harold is assistant. And what do you want to say now,
I just
Harold?
want to introduce the rest of the panelists, and then we'll let you know when it's your cue. Okay. So just a reminder that tonight's session is being recorded, so that if you do participate in the question and answer portion from the audience, you are consenting to being recorded. So now we're going to be joined by the research teams from the Cleveland Clinic and the University at Buffalo, who have set up research studies to examine the paradigm shift that is the focus of our attention tonight, which is the possibility of treating COVID in the community. Dr. Rina Mehra is professor of medicine, director of sleep disorders research, and a trained epidemiologist at the Cleveland Clinic with 18 years of experience in clinical trials and translational science. Her team includes Dr. Feijong Cheng, who unfortunately isn't able to join us tonight because of a snow issue in Ohio. But Dr. Cheng has expertise in integrative drug repurposing analytics. And we also have with us tonight Dr. Sujata Rao, who has expertise in circadian biology. They are collaborating on a proposal which has received FDA release of clinical hold to examine the effect of dual toremifene and high-dose melatonin to improve clinical outcomes in COVID-19. Dr. Cheng was lead author of the recent PLOS Biology article, which you may have seen in the news, which used an AI platform to explore drugs that can be repurposed for COVID treatment, with melatonin rising to the top of the list. Dr. Margarita Dubakovic is State University of New York Distinguished Professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology and the inaugural Senior Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion in the Jacobs School of Medicine and Biochemical Science at the University at Buffalo. Dr. Dubakovic's research focuses on understanding melatonin receptor pharmacology and their in vivo function. In her team, melatonin receptors are used as targets for the discovery and development of drugs to treat circadian rhythm disorders. Dr. Jessica Reynolds is also on the team, is an associate professor in the Department of Medicine, Division of Allergy, Immunology, and Rheumatology in the Jacobs School of Medicine. Dr. Reynolds' research expertise includes investigating immune mechanisms for HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis. She is our in-house cytokine expert for the evening. Dr. Sanjay Sethi, lost my place here, is a professor of medicine at the University of Buffalo, where he's the chief of the Pulmonary Critical Care Sleep Medicine Division, director of the Clinical Research Office, and deputy director of the UB Clinical and Translational Science Institute. Dr. Sethi's main research interests include chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and respiratory infections, specifically focusing on exacerbations, new therapeutics, and innate lung defense. So I'm going to turn it over back to Greg. I think I'm going to take you up on your point, actually. So we're kind of co-hosting this portion. So you made a couple of recommendations. Just want to make it clear that you don't have any conflict of interest. You don't have shares in these companies, or do you?
Oh, me?
Yeah, you.
No. No, I have no shares in the companies, and I certainly don't have shares in the U.S. Pharmaceutical or Pharmacopoeia, which is the agency that evaluates these drugs.
Okay, so there are, one of the issues in that article was that there is, in many of the cases, serotonin contamination. I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that, because it's unclear as to how exactly that happened or why that he was even there. Could you make some comment on that?
In fact, the amount of serotonin was tiny. It was micrograms, okay, as compared to milligrams of melatonin. And it's unlikely that to be a major problem, but still it should not be there, right, because it's, they clearly, the way they synthesized those products, they must have used serotonin as a precursor, but they should have cleaned that up.
Okay, I'd like to get back to that issue a little later, but I'd like to let our guests from the Cleveland Clinic and from Buffalo weigh in, and give us some of their thoughts on their own research, if that's okay with you, and then we can kind of start a dialogue between the panelists, if that's okay. So anybody
Good.
from those institutions want to weigh in right now?
Yeah, we can provide an overview of the work that we are doing. And then I will ask my colleagues to comment on their own part of the study. So we are conducting a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled outpatients, COVID outpatients study using outpatients that have mild to moderate symptoms. The uniqueness of our study is that we are using melatonin that is approved using an investigation a new drug from the Food and Drug Administration. So we decided to go that route so we can then be able to control for all the parameters that may be an issue, like having other substance in our melatonin preparation. Working with the FDA has been a good experience because although they had a lot of requirements and we were a little bit annoyed at the time, we were able to control now for all kind of side effects, the melatonin and and also potential interactions. So they not only provided that guidance in how to conduct the clinical trial, but also they suggested that we expand the study by doing a dose range, and that's what we're going to be doing. Currently we are using 3 doses of melatonin, 10 milligrams each per day, and we will increase the dose in a subsequent study that we start early next year to get higher doses and lower doses. So we have other parts of the study, and I will let Dr. Reynolds to discuss what she's doing, because we are collecting saliva samples, and Dr. Setti to talk a little bit about his role as a clinician in the study. Jessica?
Sure. So over the course of the study, we're collecting longitudinal saliva samples. So we collect initial prior to drug saliva sample, and then over the course of time, I think it's over 42 days. Well, we're giving the drug for 14 days, and then the FDA required that we monitor symptoms up to 42 days. So we're getting, I believe it's 6 samples of saliva over the 42 days. And we're going to look at viral load throughout the saliva levels over time. And then because we're collecting straight saliva, it's not, nothing's inactivated. We're able to measure active cytokines. I haven't quite figured out the protocol of what I'm going to do. I mean, we may measure actual melatonin now that, we're not inactivating anything and it's just straight saliva. So it gives us quite a bit of options of what we're going to do with that. But we primarily want to look at cytokine expression levels and how it changes over the time. So there's some studies that suggest you can measure, obviously you can measure cytokines in saliva. I just don't know, in the sense, based on literature, nobody's to see if we'll see enough changes in cytokines reflective of COVID. So we'll see. I think that'll be exciting to see, if we see a higher level in the beginning and that's lowered. So yeah, so that's been my part. I played a very integral role in writing the IND. It's a one-of-a-kind experience. I think I learned more about melatonin than I ever wanted to know, but it's really exciting. So
Good.
yeah, so I mean, I've learned that, so much that it can be used for, and so I think that, I guess I'm a believer now. So I'll turn it over, Sanjay, if you have any comments.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I'm kind of running the clinical trial. So we have there were several interesting challenges in doing COVID trials. One was, when we have all multi-specialty clinics. We are a university. So how do you bring in people with COVID who you tell them to stay home, right? If they're mild to moderate. So eventually, our dean was good enough to give us actually an unused clinic space. So that's become our COVID clinical research center. So we're running our COVID trials, outpatient trials over there, and in terms of the study, we try to simplify it as much as possible. We're looking at, of course, safety, because we do need to look at that, and the FDA was very insistent. Make sure this thing is safe before you start. And but we will get some efficacy data. This is a pilot level study, but we are hoping that this will lead to bigger studies in the short term. Till now we have randomized 3 people, and 2 did well. 1 ended up in the hospital, but of course we have no idea who got what. But yeah, at least the side effect profile otherwise in the 3 patients has been very acceptable. I'm excited. As with Jessica, I mean, I'm not. I've become a COVID researcher because of the situations. But I've always had an interest in respiratory infections. But when Margarita approached me and mentioned melatonin, I said, what? And of course, now with all the information that I've heard, and not just today, but earlier, I think there is a distinct possibility that it could help, but we need the evidence. And so kind of excited to do this, and hopefully we can get additional support and do some definitive large studies very quickly.
Okay, great, thanks. Rena, are you there?
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
Okay.
I'm muted now. Is that better? Okay, good. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss things. It's been great listening to everybody's perspectives. Very, very useful. So yeah, this basically is a collaborative team science effort with myself and Feizhong Cheng and Sujata, and really emanated from the exciting work that Feizhong Cheng has led using a systems pharmacology approach and platform to identify drug repurposing candidates for the treatment of SARS-CoV-2, using a model where they looked at protein-protein interactions and tried to identify dual therapy with synergistic attributes that would complement one another for the treatment of SARS-CoV-2. So, when he had published that work and, we basically got connected through that means, and there's a lot of interest and excitement about that work. And really looking at the data, it appeared that there were complementary interactions with the, host response sort of mechanisms via melatonin, with the anti-inflammatory, as has been discussed, antioxidant properties, potentially mediated via the circadian rhythm. I think that's something that's unclear. And then also the more direct antiviral effect of selective estrogen receptor modulation with the use of toremethine. So, that really then kind of connected Feizhong, Sujata, and me to then develop a proposal for a randomized clinical trial, which is called the Sentinel Trial. And we, had to go through FDA, and thankfully with getting the sage input of Dr. Reiter and Dr. Tan, we were able to kind of craft a response to the FDA to provide justification for the dosage and safety profiles of melatonin, and then also for toremethine as well. So we have actually several protocols in place because we've been applying for federal funding for the clinical trials. The Sentinel trial, the first one that was developed was focused on melatonin and toremethine, again for 14 days with 100 milligrams of melatonin Q day for 2 days, and then 60 milligrams per day thereafter. And with the collection of melatonin levels, the most recent trial, we proposed dim light melatonin onset, so salivary melatonin in the evening. And we had an NIAID application that was more mechanistically oriented to look at more of the multi-omics alterations that occurred with the treatment of early COVID-19 with toremethine, dual toremethine and melatonin. And then one that went to NCATS, NIH. With that application, we had to use tasimeltion because a melatonin agonist rather than melatonin, because they didn't allow the use of a dietary supplement. So the most recent trial involving tasimeltion is a multi-center trial with an adaptive design, factorial design, where we have monotherapy, tasimeltion, and monotherapy toremethine, dual therapy, and placebo, with an adaptive design for arms to drop out if there is deemed to not be benefit. So built into these trials are, intensive safety monitoring as, approved by the FDA. Yes, so that's basically where we're at. We have not yet started recruitment for any trials as of yet. We have multiple proposals that have gone out. 2 proposals that have been resubmitted to the NIH. and then some applications from foundation and in philanthropy. And Sujatha, I'm not sure if you have any other, thing. I'm sure I missed some things, so feel free to chime in.
Hopefully this time my mic will work. So you did give a very good introduction to our trial, but I just want to add that along with really providing the melatonin and toromorphine to the patients, one of the goal for Feijang and me in this particular trial is essentially to do a multi-omic study, because we want to look at these patients, we want to follow them, we are taking their blood samples at different times, and then we are actually doing a omic analysis as well as an RNA-seq analysis to either identify biomarkers in patients who are COVID positive and don't respond to the drugs, or in patients who do respond to the drugs, but we really want to know whether we can actually identify some kind of a molecular signature from their blood. One of the limitations is, of course, we cannot take blood at different time points, so we can only do it we are doing blood before we start the drug treatment, and then multiple days after that till the end of the trial. And that's really something from a biological perspective. We really want to understand what is it that SARS-CoV-2 is doing to these patients, and how is it that the drugs are changing. And I think that's pretty much what our trial is all about.
Okay, great, thanks. I see Dr. Castillo is back online. Did you want to try to wrap up your presentation? Just because you were cut off because of your technical difficulties. Rafi, you're still mute.
Yeah, thanks, Harold. Well, I think we're quite, we've reached a certain level of confidence about the use of high dose melatonin. Like we said, we've used up to 600 milligrams per day of melatonin. Of course, we've been kindly and courteously reminded by our regulatory authorities that it's an off-label indication, and we should always ask for the consent of patients who are given more than 10 milligrams per day of melatonin, and we've been doing that. Well, in patients with ARDS, we now have more than 20 patients who were given high dose melatonin, and well, only two of them didn't make it so far, and these were patients who were given high dose melatonin at the late stage of the disease when they're intubated already. We always recommend to give it early enough, and in patients who may be hypoxemic but are given high dose melatonin before they get intubated, they all survive 100%. So, well, we believe this might be the silver bullet Greg was referring to, and we hope to be getting the data to validate and to really support this belief. Thank you.
Okay, so the paradigm shift is treating it early in the community so that it doesn't progress to reaching hospital. I'm just wondering, I'd like to hear, we both here have the practical approach of Dr. Neil, who's had a pretty good success rate with, I would say, 1,000 or so patients, again, after a while. I mean, the numbers do matter to the scientists, but as a clinician, that's pretty amazing to hear his experience. And I think to the world, it would be almost, this is unbelievable. This is dying every day.
I'd like to add
Okay.
to Dr. Neil a couple of questions.
Sure.
One is, what is the source of his melatonin? Because there is this issue of over-the-counter melatonin, and where do you get it? And to be sure that it's okay, because it is so variable, the over-the-counter stuff. The other issue is, have you considered writing this up, because it's so important, and it's wonderful data you have. If you could only put it in print, it would be great.
No pressure, Richard.
All right, no, just had to unmute there real quick there, but yeah, the pressure, if you only knew what my days are like and how far I'm behind on paperwork already there, if I had really, I would love to write a lot of this up. But and as far as oddly enough, a lot of my patients take the nature-made
Yeah.
melatonin, actually. And long ago, when I talked to Dr. Ryder, and he was telling me which over-the-counter supplements had been tested for purity or whatever, the only name I remembered out of it from what he told me was the Natrol. And so I'd been telling people to get the Natrol, and that's a real common one. Now, I have had patients, I prefer the sublingual. To me, I've had better success with patients taking the sublingual melatonin. I've had patients that if they didn't respond as fast as I thought they should, to have them change brands, and sure enough, then they suddenly start improving. So that has made a difference a couple of times.
Yeah. Okay. With respect to Natrol, it was the first one that was approved by the USP, and then later they approved Nature Made. Now, any manufacturer can work with them if they want to. It's a voluntary thing, but they're the only two manufacturers that have submitted to USP for verification.
So I
But
subscribe.
there are a lot of patients, I have no idea where they got their melatonin, but by far, like I say, I have not had many problems with patients needing to switch brands or not. It seems to be pretty well across the board.
So I subscribe to two services. One is consumerlab.com and the other is labdoor.com. And they also do their testing. It's not USP approved, but I don't think the situation is as bad as, at least for the products that were described in Canada. I don't think the situation is as bad as that article describes. Anybody can go to labdoor.com. It's a free service. Consumer Labs is a paid service. They did testing on, Consumer Labs did testing on melatonin, and only one product actually failed. And there, you know, even if I go to now to, for example, I go looking at, let me take a quick look here, at the, well, okay, I'm having a little trouble here, but so even the natural product, or the Nature Made product, got a high score, but it didn't exactly contain the 3 milligrams that it was on the label. It was 2.88. So there is going to be variability, but I don't want to scare people. You know, in Canada, I know the study was done in Canada, but there probably are good products available in Canada. The Nature Made is available at Walmart. I couldn't find any other source. Same thing for Natural. Yeah, so I guess there is some controversy. I mean, that was one study done at that time a few years ago. It's of serious concern. My concern is that they didn't identify the names of the products in their study, which is kind of disappointing considering it was done with taxpayers' money. Any other comments on the quality of products? I guess the point I was getting to is that with Richard's amazing results that are almost hard to believe, I would like to have as a take-home message today that it is possible to treat COVID in the community, that it is possible to take the burden off the hospitals, if only the medical community would wake up to what we're proposing tonight. And maybe we don't need to go to the medical community, because there is so much resistance to this idea for numerous reasons that are sometimes mind-boggling. But Dr. Castillo actually went to the community with his article. I just wonder if you can comment on what the reaction was to your article. Did it seem to make any difference? I mean, there are a lot of readers who follow you. Did it make any dent at the time? I think your hospitals were overwhelmed when you wrote that article. Can you comment on that?
Right. Yes, yes, Harold. Well, of course, it's very difficult to quantify the impact of whatever recommendations we made. But I would say, well, it did help to some extent. We have, for example, adopted certain, so we have medical societies adopting certain barangays, and they volunteer their services in terms of just by telemedicine, by teleconsultation. So they attend to these barangays are like small communities, and the feedback we're getting is that there is a remarkable reduction in the number of confirmed COVID cases. More importantly, the number of transmissions is also reduced, and the community residents are more conscious about how to prevent and treat the COVID. So it's not, well, it's not only due to use of high dose melatonin, but I'd say it's more of a composite approach, holistic approach in the management of COVID in the community. But we involved a lot of our primary care physicians in this initiative.
Okay.
I'd like to okay. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, Rafi. Are you finished?
Yes, yes, I am.
Oh, okay. On the issue of prevention and low dose treatment, or people who are susceptible, what dose would you all recommend for prevention? What do people take? Personally, I take 10 milligrams every night, but what do others take?
Well, for our high-risk patients, we recommend a dose of 6 milligrams to 20 milligrams, depending on the degree of risk that they have, and the risk of exposure as well. For example, our hospital personnel, our colleagues who remain in the front line, so they take usually 20 milligrams per day in divided doses.
Okay.
And I agree, 10 to 20 milligrams seems to be a good dosage for most of it. I'm amazed, as I've talked to more and more people, how many people actually are out there that take 10 to 20 milligrams every day and have for years. So.
Russ, I know you take it. How much do you take? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
He's muted, right?
You have to unmute.
Yeah, Russ, you're muted. If you're talking, you're muted.
You're still muted.
You're still muted.
In the bottom left-hand corner, if you're looking to you'll see the word mute. Just click on that, and it will unmute you. Nope, no luck.
No luck so far.
It'll be a secret for now. Okay, Greg, can you explain why?
Now.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
There he is.
70 milligrams. You asked me
70 milligrams.
70 milligrams, and like Rafi, I've been taking melatonin for 27 years on a regular basis, daily. I would like to ask the clinicians about COVID and gastrointestinal. If you take oral, I would imagine if you take oral melatonin, it would surely be very beneficial to prevent COVID gastrointestinal infection. Have you seen that to be the case? Or do any of your patients show up with gastrointestinal diarrhea and so forth associated with COVID? Richard or Rafael?
Yeah, so in the first wave, I didn't see much
You never see
GI issues. The second wave, it was a lot of GI issues. And now a lot of people who take the sublingual melatonin, I'm sure they swallow half of it or more.
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
So it's not like they're not getting some oral as well. But oddly, in this, what I'd call the third wave here, I'm not seeing as much GI problems with these patients. One thing I would like to iterate, though, is one of the big things that the sooner patients start on melatonin, the better. It's just that,
Right.
that I can't reiterate that enough. That seems to make a huge difference in there.
So I'm a little concerned about the dosages we're talking about in terms of the receptivity of the message. So Russ, if you're taking 70 to start with, and Richard, you're using 100 milligrams to treat it. And it seems to me that you're talking about a potent molecule, because I know we don't like the word hormone. But I can see how some skeptical doctors will say, well, we don't know what the long-term effects are of taking this. Maybe short-term to treat COVID, sure, a week or two. But even then, they're going to be concerned about using a high dose. We haven't really talked about drug interactions, contraindications, using it in patients who are immunocompromised or transplant patients. Perhaps can we expand on those concerns a bit?
Well, all I can say is 27 years is relatively long term. And that's how long I've been taking it. I'm still surviving. Now you may think I look dead, but actually I'm alive. In reference to drug interactions, Margarita and I had a short discussion about this some time ago. Of course, the dose is different than physiological concentrations, but every drug that has ever been tested in any species anywhere has been tested in the presence of melatonin. Says melatonin exists in every organism that we can identify. And therefore, at least in terms of physiological levels of melatonin, drugs cannot be tested without determining its interaction with physiological levels. So, but like I say, if you take more like I do, that's a slightly different story. But nevertheless, the drug interactions, as long as melatonin has been used since the early 1990s, I have not heard, that doesn't mean there hasn't been any, but I have not heard any of serious drug interactions for melatonin at any dose. Like I say,
if you go to the internet there, the theoretical possibilities are listed there, and that will turn some people off. So can you comment on that?
But I can also comment on that. The fact is that the content of the body tissues is high already. The physiologic levels in the body are much higher than you might think. So when you take a dose by mouth, and actually only a certain amount of that ends up in the bloodstream, and that's not a high level, really.
I agree with Greg on that point. As we now know, what he pointed out about the gastrointestinal tract, the amount of melatonin, that's 400 times greater than the pineal. We have estimated recently that maybe only 5% of the total melatonin that the body produces is actually derived from the pineal gland. I don't know if all of you know the work of Dr. Friedlander at Pittsburgh. He has shown that, in fact, the enzymes for melatonin production are present in the mitochondria of the brain and likely some other cells.
Those of us who understand about melatonin will use it for ourselves or have it for ourselves. And I sleep better at night knowing that I have the melatonin. But I wake up every morning to listen to the news, and it breaks my heart that people are dying, and those people might be dying unnecessarily, especially the elderly, especially those in our nursing homes, and the resistance of nursing home doctors to even consider this. They have an experiment that they could so easily do. They have a captive audience, and there's real resistance to that idea. So I'm kind of mixed. You know, we have the academics, and absolutely we need to do science. I don't want to undermine science. I mean, that's not the message I want to give people. But this is a matter of life and death. And the majority of people will get over their COVID without any problems, although there is the issue of the long haulers that's coming up now. So I think that even though people aren't dying from it, especially the younger people, there are a lot of people who are having chronic symptoms. So I think the question is, what is the ethics here? The ethics to me is that if we have a treatment versus as no treatment, as was pointed out, Pascal's wager, go for the treatment. I'm personally going to take melatonin if I come down with COVID. I think everybody on this panel is going to as well, based on Dr. Neal's work. So, there come ethical issues that I'd like to hear from the academics, because I don't think it's going to catch on to the point where they won't have patients for their research studies to prove the point. But I'd like to hear from others as well, because I'd like to, after tonight, go to the media, probably going to be ignored, but and give them a copy of tonight's presentation and say, is there a story here for you? Because melatonin is different than hydroxychloroquine. You needed a doctor to get hydroxychloroquine. This is about empowering patients with information. It's an over-the-counter product. To stand in the way of that, I think is unethical on some level. Let people decide for themselves what they're going to do. They can certainly make worse decisions. I think that it's a fascinating cultural phenomena. If I was reading about in Central and South America, that melatonin is not even on the radar. Ivermectin is on the radar, and people are trying to get their doctors to prescribe that because word of mouth has spread. Now, why is melatonin not being spread by word of mouth in those areas? It's a really interesting question. Dr. Sethi said, what? That's, most people would add TF at the end of that. But we have a real problem here in getting this message out. And I just like to, I think I've talked too much, but I'd like everyone on the panel to maybe comment on that from their perspective. Maybe even start with the people who haven't said much so far.
Well, I'd like to reinforce the necessity for the clinical trials, if for no other reason, to convince the physicians of its validity.
Right.
I go to my cardiologist and my dermatologist, and they both use melatonin themselves, but when I ask them if they recommend it, they say, no, we don't. There are no clinical trials.
Right.
If there were clinical trials, I think the physicians would readily jump on board. So from that standpoint, they're certainly very important. With regard to the long-term side effects, this is always what we call a catch-22. How are you going to learn the long-term side effects if you can never test them long-term? For prescription drugs, I understand they have to be tested in 2 species for 2 years. And if they have no long-term effects within 2 years, then they're approved. And yet we know that a lot of drugs have very serious long-term effects. A good example is doxorubicin, which incidentally, there's plenty of studies in animals showing that doxorubicin at the level of the heart, its toxicity is greatly reduced by melatonin, because doxorubicin recycles in the mitochondria of the cardiomyocytes and generates free radicals. And the profession of melatonin, one of the professions of melatonin, is in fact to neutralize the toxicity. I think a lot of drugs that are toxic would actually benefit if they were given in combination with melatonin.
Okay, I'd like to get the rest of the members to weigh in, but just as a sales pitch, just I want to, while we're talking about that, would you say, if I was talking to another physician, that if they were reviewing tonight's presentation, that the way to think about melatonin in treating COVID would be that that you're manipulating the mitochondria? Would that be a fair way to sell this?
Part of it.
Well, it's certainly improving the function of the mitochondria,
Right.
for sure.
And would that be good enough to keep people from getting sicker? Or is there more to it? I mean, obviously there's more to it than that, but I'm just looking for...
well, doesn't it also help to prevent the entry of the virus into the receptor that it attacks?
Well, there's not a great deal of evidence for preventing the, for example, ACE2 inhibition.
Okay.
I don't know of any studies that suggest that. There are a couple of studies implying that the virus maybe can be stunted if you give melatonin in terms of reproducing itself. So although it will not kill the virus, there's no evidence that melatonin will kill the virus, none.
Right.
But there may be other means by which it functions.
I think perhaps if you target talking about the cytokine storm and the cytokines, because everybody thinks about, cytokine storm associated with COVID more than mitochondria effects.
Okay.
So I think, potential changing in the function of your macrophage, as Dr. Reiter showed, potentially shifting from the phenotypes or controlling cytokine production and that type of stuff.
Yep.
I would like to hear the opinions of other individuals, Professor Cardinale or whoever. I mean, he's got a great deal of experience also with melatonin, and I know he's very interested in COVID.
Okay, Russ, thank you for leaving me to, well, in my view, there is one point that no one addressed, and it's what we are going to do with the vaccines in the future. We are waiting for the vaccines as the way we can live this nightmare, really, from the pandemic. But one has to think in the possibility that vaccines will work together with melatonin as an adjuvant to increase the immune response. And I think that this is something which is in the future, and we have to consider that possibility, that to use melatonin as an adjuvant in vaccination is something that we have to consider very seriously, because we have evidence, for example, for many diseases, prevention in veterinary science, for example, prevention of diseases in lambs, prevention of viral vaccine, the increase of immunity after vaccination. So I think that that's a real thing we have to consider in the future. And of course, we are looking one of the problems. For example, we are engaged in some clinical studies here in Buenos Aires, and one of the problems we have is that we have less and less patients in the very extreme situation of the internal, of the IQ internal there. So apparently we are facing, and this is happening all over the world, we are facing a decrease in the lethality of the virus. And then, well, melatonin will serve, of course, to treat the urgent situation of those patients. But in the future, we have to consider the possibility that melatonin can be an adjuvant for vaccination.
Good.
Well, for your information, Daniel, we have a paper in press on that very topic. We also agree with that. That in combination with the vaccines, melatonin would be beneficial.
That's actually covered in Daniel's silver bullet paper too. So he's very much in agreement.
Yeah.
So what kind of dosage would you use for boosting the effect of the vaccinations?
Well, we don't know really. The problem of the dose is a problem that is difficult to answer. We have, from animal studies, we can allometrically calculate doses, for example, in the close to the levels of the 100 milligrams in several situations. I mean, in the acute infection. But in our experience, we had a very small experience with patients with COVID, which were not in intensive care unit, but in the general ward in the hospital. And when we used 9 milligrams of melatonin per day, which is the regular dose we can use in accordance with the regulation in Argentina from the national authorities, we could see how those amounts, what really we thought they were low, but indeed what we see is that the number of days of people in the ward decreased significantly as compared to those other persons who were not receiving melatonin. So I was very in favor of higher doses than 9 milligrams. But what I can see is that in those patients, there was a small series of patients, 40 patients, that we saw in that small population with 9 milligrams of melatonin, we could decrease the time spent in the hospital of those patients.
Yes, that's in keeping with what Dr. Castillo was doing with the higher doses. So, so that's it's encouraging, even though that low doses can be somewhat effective.
Okay, Margarita has a comment to make.
You're muted.
You're muted, Margarita. Yes.
Nobody will hear me.
There you
Nice
are.
to see you, Daniel. So you tell me that in Argentina, you are not allowed to prescribe or to give melatonin in doses higher than 9 milligrams a day?
Well, okay, as a physician, I can do that because I can prescribe off-label. And indeed, I have many patients around me who are receiving 50, 100 milligrams of melatonin for many comorbidities. I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about cardiac diseases, diabetes, the minimal cognitive impairment, which is a situation that when one looks to the reports of brain fog in patients after leaving the intensive care unit with COVID, this is something very important to consider. That is that we have experience with minimal cognitive impairment and melatonin for more than 4 years treating patients. So I can prescribe melatonin in doses which, as a responsibility as a physician, I can do that off-label, but I cannot use off-label amounts of melatonin which are greater than 9 milligrams, 12 milligrams for example, carried out an experiment on COVID patients. Indeed, we need the approval of the authorities in order to go to the higher doses in that aspect.
Thank you. I have another question, if I may. And this question is for Danielle or maybe Ras. I've been looking for this, and can you tell me if there is any good study doing a dose response or a concentration effect curve on the effect of melatonin in inhibition of cytokinins? Because when we are talking about doses, maybe when we go from a very low dose to 30, 50, 100, we may have been saturating that particular mechanism. So I don't really know whether there is a difference between 50 milligrams and 100 milligrams. I don't know. Is there any good study in which they have measured effect of melatonin on cytokinins?
I think, Margarita, you have a good point. Again, I was going to ask you, for example, there's always been this idea, certainly some of the protective effects, maybe all of them, are mediated by receptors. And theoretically, those receptors can be downregulated by pharmacological doses of melatonin. And yet I see no evidence in terms of the measurements that we have made and continue to make that the receptor mediated actions are prevented by pharmacological doses of melatonin. Large doses, 60 to 100 milligrams, is there a difference? I don't know. And what is the minimal effective dose that could be used? Maybe Richard or Rafael can comment on. What do you think the minimal effective dose of melatonin would be for the treatment of COVID? We are talking about doses that have not been uniformly established as the appropriate dose. Would Greg takes 10 milligrams per day. Is he protecting himself from COVID? I'm taking 70. Am I better protected than Greg?
I'd say you're a lot better protected. I'd say in my experience, I've found that 50 milligrams is kind of the minimum dose to treat someone with COVID symptoms.
Very good information. Very good information.
A lot of times, if you tell patients 100 milligrams, well, they'll take at least 50 and they'll still get better. So.
No, that's treatment. Now, are you saying that the same dose is necessary for prevention as for treatment?
No. No, in fact, I think there has been a study out recently, and I swear that came from the Cleveland Clinic, that showed that people that were taking 10 to 20 milligrams had a lot lower infection rate.
Well, you have to understand there's an argument that elderly people get COVID more rapidly, more frequently, because they have lower levels of melatonin, which is often the case. We're talking here physiological levels of melatonin dropping and we get COVID. Well, do you really need 70 milligrams? I take 70 milligrams because I want to prevent. But what would be the minimal dose? Richard says he would treat with no less than 50.
Okay, for prophylaxis of people that I know have had a strong exposure, I use 40 milligrams. And that seems to work pretty darn well for a lot of people. That's, you know you got a good exposure. That seems to be the basic dose for that.
Rafael or Dan, do you have any input here?
Yeah, Rafi may well know. But you have to unmute. Unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah,
yes.
So like we shared in our first attempt at high dose melatonin, we used 36 to 72 milligrams per day in 4 divided doses. And it's an observation, but that seemed to have worked. Now in a randomized controlled trial, as you know, well, you're part of the study group, we're using much higher doses of melatonin. We don't know, it's a double-blind trial, so we don't know if it's more effective than the lower dose that we tried it. But I can say that even at a dose of 36 to 72 milligrams, we can appreciate some benefit. I would just like to add that I think the frequency of dosing is also very important. So we're giving it at almost every 6 hours, 4 times a day, because we know very well that melatonin is a very short-acting drug. And we're not giving it just to enhance sleep at night. We're giving it to boost their immune system, and that will require a sustained effect. I mean, at least 24/7, at least for the acute infection. So I would dare to say that, at the minimum, it should be given during the acute phase at least 4 times a day, every 6 hours, and then we can reduce that. Incidentally, we're now giving it for 4 weeks, as you might have noted, because we've had at least 6 out of more than 100 cases that we've given high-dose melatonin whose COVID symptoms recurred within the first month after, we thought that the patient had fully recovered. Then they came back with COVID symptoms. They were tested and they turned out to be COVID positive. So this might be part of the long hauler, which Harold mentioned earlier. So we're now recommending that we give the real high dose for 1 week, and then we scale down the dose to a minimum of 1 milligram per kilogram body weight up to day 28. And then we just maintain at the dose of 6 to 20 milligrams per day at bedtime, again, depending on the risk of the patient and the exposure the patient has.
So I just had regarding dose, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues. And I just want to bring up a question. In my mind, inflammation and oxidative stress are double-edged swords. You need some. You don't want to completely eliminate them. So I'm wondering, isn't there a likelihood that once you get to beyond the optimal dose, and I still don't think we know what the optimal dose is, that you may start having some negative effects of excessive reduction of inflammation and oxidative stress?
Well, there's no history of that. Melatonin has been used by humans for 30 years. There's been tens of thousands of animal studies, and melatonin, that is not a complicating factor in terms of producing negative effects.
Are there good dose
And
ranging?
that doesn't mean it's a perfect molecule. There's no such thing, but it's the best thing we currently have, I think, for treating COVID and likely some other conditions. With certainly less toxicity than some of the other things that are in fact used.
I'd like to make a comment concerning the doses, the distribution of doses along the day. One of the problems I see when we are giving 4 equal doses every 4 hours, for example, in 24 hours, is that we are losing the chronobiotic effect of melatonin. And of course, for physiologists, chronobiotic effect means very, very small amounts within the range of the receptors. But for the clinician to keep the signal, for example, giving melatonin, covering, for example, in the extreme situation of the infection, rather than giving 4 doses of melatonin equal, we probably can distribute the dose in higher amounts at the time of sleep and smaller amounts during the day. The advantage of that can be to keep the chronobiotic signal still alive, and this is extremely important from the recovery of the patient. I'd like to know what Dr. Castillo think about that, because he's using doses in regular, similar doses in 24 hours, right?
Yeah, I would like to invite the Cleveland Clinic people, Dr. Rao, who is actually an expert in circadian biology, and Dr. Merritt, who's an expert in sleep. Could you comment on this discussion? Are you there?
Yeah, I think this is really a great discussion. I think the dosage, issue is one that we really had a lot of discussion and conversation about as we were developing the proposal and as we were working with the FDA. And again, you know, Dr. Reiter, Dr. Tan, I think as we delved into even the experimental models and literature and animal models and the data that in literature that we have in humans, I think we, just the 100 milligrams seemed well aligned with the literature in terms of the influence on inflammation, oxidative stress, and so forth. We do have we have a registry, a Cleveland Clinic registry of patients, and we did look at melatonin as it related to SARS-CoV-2 positivity. And we found that there was about a 30 to 40% reduced likelihood of SARS-CoV-2 infection in those who were taking melatonin compared to those who were not. And that's using a propensity matched analysis, trying to adjust for confounders, including comorbidities. So we did try to look at dosage. We tried to extract that from the medical record. It just was not easy for us to do, and I don't think there was anything meaningful that we could glean from that. Interesting things of note was that when race-specific relationships were examined, it seemed that potentially African Americans may have derived a greater protective benefit from the melatonin compared to Caucasians. So that's something I thought that was pretty interesting. And with those with diabetes, potentially a bit more of a benefit per that data. So I think, as we think about the vulnerable populations, that is those who are older, those who, are in underserved areas, those who are, these race-specific, worse clinical outcomes that are observed, and those with comorbidity, perhaps those are the populations that may derive most benefit. And again, this is limited. It's a large registry, but and we did try to adjust for confounding as much as possible. But I think those are some other thoughts.
Yeah, and I kind of just want to add to that. This is a great discussion about the really great benefits of melatonin. But something that we tend to forget is that melatonin also regulates the circadian rhythm of the host. And that by itself can have multiple effects. So it doesn't really have to be that melatonin is acting directly. So when we're talking about dose, that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, because the vulnerable population that we're talking about are the older population. They already do have some circadian rhythm disruptions by that age. So that's perhaps one of the reasons why melatonin can be beneficial for that particular population. And something I think that we didn't really talk about in this discussion, there is a sex-specific, there's some kind of a sexual dimorphism in the severity of COVID, SARS-CoV-2 infection. And I was just wondering if anybody had any thoughts about how would you treat, do you think it would be more beneficial to give a higher dose versus a lower dose based on sex?
Go ahead, Margarita.
I just want to, I couldn't hear very well what you said. I'm sorry if I am going to repeat something. I just wanted to respond to Danielle's question, and in the fact that, it would be nice to keep the chronobiological profile in every individual, but with the doses we are using, or we said we are using, it's impossible to keep the chronobiology, because in order to modify circadian rhythms or even sleep, you really need low doses. And because there are certain periods of sensitivity for modulation of circadian rhythms, when you use a high dose, even the pharmacokinetics is about 20 minutes to 30 minutes. It goes to half-life. You keep still melatonin in the system. So on one side, you are going to advance the rhythm. On the other side, you are going to delay the rhythm. So there is no, the rhythms uncancel themselves, and that's very well established. So perhaps the model that Danielle wants to use, more melatonin at night and less melatonin during the day, could work, but under regular conditions, it's very difficult to keep the circadian system in shape. Like that.
I think the analogy might be the use of prednisone, right? To where we have physiological doses of cortisol, and then we're completely overriding it by giving high doses for short periods of time. Dr. Sethi can comment on that as he's a specialist who probably uses a lot of steroids. Can you elaborate on that comment? Is that a good analogy, or do you see some difference?
Yeah, I mean, steroids are absolutely, the whole chronobiological effects are clearly disrupted with the high doses we use. And that's why, we in fact, when we were designing our study, we talked about it, should we give a higher dose at night? And then we said, we're giving fairly large doses, and that's going to already kind of disrupt. But I agree with Sujata's comments. I mean, maybe that's something that needs to be looked at a bit more closely. I mean, having the circadian rhythms are there for a reason, and are beneficial to our health. So maybe in the subsequent, because most probably we'll end up doing a dose ranging study beyond this, and maybe this is something we should consider, is how we dose, and maybe a higher dose in the evening would not be inappropriate.
So in the Cleveland Clinic study, what kind of dose what kind of dosing regimen? Is it one-time dosing, or is it split through the day?
No, we decided on 100 milligrams total for 2 days, and then 60 milligrams a day for 12 days for a total of 2 weeks. And the doses are divided so that there's a higher evening dose.
Oh, yeah.
So 40 milligrams in the morning, 60 in the evening. Still a pretty high dose though in the morning. So, it's just, it is hard to know. In some of the studies that have been done that have used dosages in that range, I think the main thing is the sleepiness, the daytime sleepiness. And with the FDA, that's something that was brought up. So as one of our exclusions, we have, drowsy driving, or especially, if these folks are going to be coming in, which, as per the FDA, we have to have them come back for a visit, for an in-person visit, for a blood draw, to repeat some of the safety measures. So if they're going to be driving, or those sorts of things, so drowsy driving, operating heavy machinery, which of course are going to be in quarantine, so hopefully they're not doing that. Those are the kinds of things that we were thinking about in terms of our eligibility.
I have a question about the whole circadian rhythm issue. It was my impression that light was the primary synchronizer of your circadian rhythms, and that melatonin was secondary to light in that effect. So if you pay careful attention to light and dark, can't you still maintain your circadian rhythmicity? Is that possible? Throw that out for discussion.
Before we get to that, I'm just noticing that we're running low on time. I mean,
okay.
Our rhythm is to go probably all night if we tuned into the discussion we're having right now. So unfortunately, we couldn't get to any of the questions from the audience. So Manny, if you can post the email addresses of all the participants, so that they can jot down if they have any further questions from the participants tonight, that would be helpful. Manny, can you do that? Okay, so if anybody has any further questions from any of the speakers here, then we'll leave that up. And while that is up, we'll just send it out to the rest of the participants to deal with Dr. Brown's question. So any comments on his question?
So I'm just going to say that I totally agree that light is definitely the strongest entrainment for your rhythm. But now there's a lot of data out there that also shows that other things like intake of food can also regulate your rhythm. So I don't really, I mean, light regulating your light dark cycle would probably be great. But it's also known that as you get older, whether you regulate that or not, it may not have any beneficial effect on your rhythms.
So the upshot from that is that melatonin is not the only thing that's involved. And if you pay attention to all the other factors that could regulate your rhythms, you could stay in sync.
Yes.
I just want to comment on that issue. Of course, there may be some circadian disruption by taking melatonin during the day. But if melatonin is being used to treat a serious condition like COVID, that's a pretty small price to pay if in fact you can prevent the disease. We always want to do our best, maintain circadian rhythms. Most people abuse their circadian rhythm just by the virtual light cycle they're in, such as we are doing right now. Most of us are in an environment where it's already dark, and we are sitting here with the lights on. We are abusing our circadian system. We all do it on a regular basis.
Good point.
And I think the other point too, as you know, for those studies that are targeting early COVID, in particular, those who are in quarantine, their external environmental cues that entrain their rhythm are going to be off in terms of their social interactions, in terms of their physical activity. So I think, I think it does behoove us, in these studies to look at those circadian rhythm measures, whether it's via actigraphy, whether it's via dim light melatonin onset. I think understanding how that interplay with the circadian rhythm, what is it doing in this whole context is important, as we're thinking about these trials.
And of course, people who are in hospital, are they under light 24 hours if they're really ill? And shouldn't there be dimming of the lights or some way of manipulating their light environment?
At least filtering out the blue wavelengths, which are most inhibitory.
Yeah, that would help.
I had a question for the panel in general. I mean, obesity, should that be a factor in dosing? Should we be having differential dosing for people who are, have very high BMIs?
I generally dose higher for people with high BMIs. Definitely.
Yes, that's called allometry, and it's used substantially by the pharmaceutical industry to judge the dosing for children versus adults, etc. It's always based on BMI, not on body weight.
Right. Yeah, because those are individuals especially at high risk for COVID, serious COVID.
Sure.
So
sure.
I was wondering whether that should be something we should be taking into consideration.
Yeah.
All right, so it's 10 o'clock, and I'm sure we could keep the discussion going all night and totally disrupt our circadian rhythms. So I'd like to thank all of the participants for helping us get perspective on a complicated issue. And so I'll wish everyone a good night and thanks. And we can keep this discussion going afterwards between ourselves and looking for possibly some feedback from the audience as well. So thank you all and good night. And
thank you, Harold.
Okay, thank you.
Harold, thank you. You did an amazing job.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.